welcome to Hardtalk India. For centuries, the Indian people have intrigued the outside world and countless books have been written about them. But now comes a book which argues that the outside world's image of India is based on a falsehood. Here to tell us why, and more importantly, here to tell us how he sees the Indian people, is the author of Being Indian, Pawan Verma. Mr. Verma, your book, Being Indian, is an attempt to reveal the truth about the Indian people and their attitudes, but it's not always a welcome or even a complimentary truth. So let me start by asking you, how has the book been received?
The book has been received well because I think people want to have an accurate assessment about Indians, and Indians want to know who they are. Of course, it's irritated a few people because it deconstructs so many myths we've nurtured about ourselves.
In fact, as you say, your central premise is that the image the outside world, and maybe many Indians themselves have of India, is based on a falsehood. As you put it, over the years, the Indian leadership and the educated Indian have deliberately projected and embellished an image about Indians that they know to be untrue. What is worse, they have fallen in love with this image and can no longer accept that it is untrue.
You see, Karan, most nations indulge in myth-making, especially newly independent nations. And India in 1947, like any newly independent nation, cherished a few myths about itself. There's nothing wrong in that. Over a period of time, though, as nations develop a self-confidence, as people begin to see themselves as they should see themselves in the mirror before them, Indians forgot that there is a difference between the image and reality. And I believe that people should know their foundational weaknesses and strengths in order to be actually fulfilling citizens of their country. You cannot live in a make-believe world anymore.
In fact, the difference between the reality and the myth is sometimes pretty fundamental. For instance, as you argue, because India is the world's biggest democracy, Indians in the world seems to have concluded that the Indians have a democratic temperament. Because Hinduism sees the world as transient, people feel that the Indians are unmaterialistic or otherworldly. Or because this country has given birth to several religions, people think that the Indian people are spiritual and tolerant. In all these cases, the truth is actually otherwise.
Well, I believe that Indians were not necessarily intrinsically democratic by temperament. You know that we come from a socially stratified society, which for thousands of years has been incorrigibly hierarchical. So we are not necessarily a great republican democracy. The miracle of India is that in spite of that the lack of democratic temperament, we have become a flourishing democracy. But we must know the truth about ourselves.
And therefore, in a real sense, your book is stripping away the mask and revealing the reality that lies beneath.
The reality which need not all be uncomplimentary. I think what we have come to believe as uncomplimentary in many ways could be our strength.
But even if it is uncomplimentary, it's salutary and it's necessary to see and recognize.
I think so long as people live in a make-believe world, it's so tiring, it's fatiguing. We must be comfortable in our skins. 60 years almost after independence, if a country and its people cannot begin to accept themselves as who they actually are, I think it's extremely tedious.
All right, then let's come to your findings, so to speak. You write that Indians are obsessed with power as an end in itself and for power, and for no other reason. You say that more often than not, it's power rather than principle that motivates them.
Well, you know, in our country, in a hierarchical society, especially a society like India, where it's been like a pressure cooker of hierarchy, people, status and power are two ends in themselves. And you see that in everyday life. I think Mahatma Gandhi was the exception in having volitionally said no to power. But in general, in the Indian ethos is that the end is more important than the means. That is also our strength because it makes us overcome adversity in impossible circumstances. But in the field of politics, it certainly means that the means are less important than the end.
But in fact, beyond politics, even in social relationships, you write that Indians have brought power into how they relate with those that they meet. For instance, when they meet a stranger, they have to size him or her up to be able to understand where he fits into the social hierarchy and how in turn they respond to him.
But don't you know that if two Indians meet, one of the first questions they do is to carefully and quickly ascertain who is what on the scale of hierarchy. Who knows whom, whose father was whom, where do you live, what are your contacts, and which immediately gives them a sense. A foreign writer has written that we have a radar sense of sensitivity about relativities in power. And we see that in everyday
It is
life.
actually a sixth sense, isn't it? This ability to pick up and establish where a man or woman belongs socially.
You see, it's probably an inherited gene, because for so many years we have determined a person's ability and merit purely on the basis of the status he occupies in a verifiable and seen hierarchy.
And there's even a word for it in Urdu, auqat.
Auqat.
There's probably no similar word in any other language.
I think it's a difficult word to translate, but if you travel on the roads of India, even trucks have something written behind them, you know, saying,
Know your
"Apne
place."
auqat mat bhool, don't forget your place. So Indians are very conscious about auqat.
And as a result of this, it deeply affects how they relate with people who are either seen to be their seniors or below them hierarchically. As you point out, to seniors, they always use the word sir, and they avert their eyes, they don't look straight in the face. But they treat juniors with a certain distance, if not disdain.
Because they expect from the juniors the same degree of deference they are showing to their seniors. It's the dialectic of deference and hostility. Deference towards someone who is hierarchically superior. And Indians can debase themselves very visibly in showing that deference. It is not a subtle deference. Hierarchy means that you show that deference in a manner that it is noticeable to your superior.
But in fact, they don't feel they're debasing themselves when they show that difference. It's part of the order of things as far as they're concerned.
It's part of the order of things, certainly very much so in government, but even outside government, and I have noticed that in the private sector as well.
Now, there's a second aspect of Indianness, if I may so call it, that you reveal in your book, and this time perhaps it's not as easy to come to terms with. It's what you call the moral relativism or the moral ambivalence of the Indian people. As you put it, there are no uncontested definitions of right and wrong. The only consistent concern is the end result. In the pursuit of the desired goal, morality is not so much disowned as it is pragmatically devalued.
You see, we are a pragmatic people. And I believe that
not an immoral people.
Well, you know, there is no definition of absolute immorality in Hinduism. I haven't come across it. For every situation which is condemnable, there is in Hinduism another which condones it. Even Duryodhan in the Mahabharata, when he died, was showered with flower petals because he was a Veer. So Hinduism is at the ontological level, at the metaphysical level, a very, very evolved religion. It does not believe in black and whites. It does not say this is wrong.
If I can interrupt, this is a very interesting thing. You're saying that there are no black and whites of morality in Hinduism. There is instead the grey of moral ambivalence.
See,
and yet that's evolved.
No, there is the grey of moral ambivalence because it imparts flexibility and it strengthens the tendency to slightly dilute absolutisms in favor of a worldly pragmatism which says, yes, this could perhaps be wrong, but perhaps it's useful for certain ends which are right.
There is a corollary to this that you could argue. Because there are no certainties and because there is pragmatism, there is a sort of tolerance as well. The extremities that go with defined positions are absent.
Well, there is a certain tolerance, and in fact that is one of the reasons, and that is what I mean when I say weaknesses can become strengths. I believe there is a tolerance in India to some of the deviations that have happened in Indian politics as politics in form of a democracy starts to consolidate
Unfortunately,
itself.
there's also tolerance because of this for corruption. In fact, corruption, as you argue in your book, is not wrong as long as it yields results, and as a result, it's become a way of life in India.
Well, I think that corruption has something to do with our not considering things to be absolutely right and wrong and always relating them to desired ends only. But I believe that the same, and I argue this in my book, the same resilience which allows you to reach a goal irrespective of the means, even if it involves corruption, is also the source of our resourcefulness and enterprise.
And I want very much to talk about that resilience because it's a very important part of your book. But before I do that, there is one other aspect of Indianness that you reveal. It's your conclusion about why democracy has taken root and flourished in this country. You say it's because democracy has proved to be the most effective instrument for the cherished pursuit of power. It's because democracy provides legitimacy to the hierarchies that are part of the Indian order of things.
I argue that initially democracy in the Westminster model was a foreign implant. Again, as I said earlier, the miracle of India is that it has survived. Now, how did this happen? This is the most interesting question. I believe it happened because initially it was looked upon by the entrenched classes as an instrument for upward mobility, as a means of pole vaulting the accepted scale of things through the ballot box. But democracy is a strange animal. Over a period of time, if it is provided that critical gestation period to survive, it begins to plant ideas in those who are supposed to be just quiescent communities of the entrenched and the powerful. And the real result of democracy in India has been a shift in the empowerment towards the weaker and dispossessed.
I don't disagree with any of that, but where I would like to question you a bit is when you argue that the democratic temperament in India hasn't developed. Surely now, 57 years later, it has begun to develop side by side.
Slowly, and much too slowly.
Would
But I believe it will happen because democracy is not instant coffee.
But
600 years of democracy in Switzerland did not lead to the empowerment of women until the 1960s. Every nation evolves its own set of democratic norms. In France, you have a democracy but with no royalty. In England, you have democracy preserving the accident of birth and a feudal nobility. India too will evolve, but as of now, I believe much more needs to be done to reinforce the democratic
But isn't
temperament.
that being done in a sense by the press and news television, by NGOs and the courts? Aren't they pushing that process?
Undoubtedly, undoubtedly. And I'm not saying that for a moment the process is not ongoing. All I'm saying is much more needs to be done. And frankly, Karan, you see it in everyday life.
All right, let's come to the positive qualities that you see. There are two of them in particular that you identify. One of them you mentioned a moment ago is the resilience of the Indian people, the fact that they accept the unacceptable, that they don't feel deprived, they don't wallow in self-pity. Now, usually, that is a quality ascribed to the influence of Hinduism. You disagree, so to whom or to what would you make this accountable?
You see, I believe the resilience of the Indian people is one, that there are very few people in any part of the world who have lived so long with so much adversity and learned to survive.
But why have they learned to survive?
Because they've learned to survive because there's hope. Ultimately, you must remember that the depression or the deprivation that you associate with India is not psychological. A person who has a cycle aspires to get a scooter. A person who has a scooter is dreaming of a Maruti 800, and so on and so forth. There is always the waterline of hope above the line of despair in India. So combined with our inherited trait of survival in the most difficult of circumstances is this new sense today that there is hope and we do have a place in the sun. And therefore foreigners are completely surprised to see Indians living in the most unacceptable circumstances, still retaining that inventive fortitude, that springiness within them, which refuses to die.
In fact, hope is the second positive quality that you identify in your book. You're rather witty about it. You say the real Indian rope trick is the persistence of hope in the most hopeless of circumstances. But what does that hope come from? The fact that there is opportunity to do better, which actually realizes itself, or is it something spiritual, something to do with their faith?
Well, I think that faith reinforces everything else in India. Remember that the Vedas say there are 33 gods, the Puranas say that 330 million gods. Spiritualism in India is functioning. I mean, there are 2.5 million temples, but only 1.4 million schools. India is a religious country, and that's religious spiritualism reinforces all these traits. But I think the hope comes today, that hope survives because there is a genuine feeling that there is scope for hope. You know, Karan, 200...
You mean because the system works and they do slowly, steadily move up,
steadily
there is
move
hope.
up. There is a 200,000 Indians take the exam for the IIT JEE. Only 1% qualify. But parents start grooming their children from the age of 5 because they believe that they too have a right to that place under the sun.
But then there's a very interesting corollary to this resilience and side by side to this hope. It suggests that unlike countries like Russia, China, and maybe even Iran, a revolution is not just unlikely, perhaps it's even impossible in India.
I think it's impossible. A revolution in the classic sense, because I believe that ultimately 55 years and more of democracy has created stakeholders in the system who are not now dependent on somebody's largesse, but believe they can carve out their piece from the cake as they want it. Sometimes this is delusional. Sometimes it's unrealistic, but the hope persists, and there are enough role models who are proving it for them.
Now, in your book, you've also, perhaps for the very first time, described the new pan-Indian identity that is reshaping India. You variously describe it as nonchalantly lowbrow, hybrid, irreverent, dismissive of criticism, and confidently self-assertive. But are those terms of praise or are those terms of criticism?
I think we should overarch both praise and criticism. My job is to identify a trend which I see happening around me across India.
Almost like a sociologist.
Almost like a sociologist. All I feel is that, you know, if you get caught in categories of condemnation and appreciation, we are ignoring the truth. We are biased parties. I see it happening around me. I believe that a new self-assertive culture in India, which is pan-Indian in scale, which for the first time gives an Indian in any part of India more than one symbol to identify himself or herself with all of India. I think this is happening, and it's only because it's happening that Daler Mehndi sells a record number of his CDs in Kerala.
And this ought not to be the case because one is Punjabi and in the north and the other is deep in the south.
And because it has happened, and the important thing of this pan-Indian culture is that it seems to have evolved almost incidentally over a period of time in the absence of organized pressure from the center.
But then tell me this, is this pan-Indian culture reinforcing or is it replacing the moral relativism and the pursuit of power?
I think it incorporates it.
So they go side by side?
They go side by side. We have our past heritage on that without obliterating it, because history doesn't evolve in terms of watertight compartments. You have with you the baggage of the past, and on that you build some of the foundations of the future, and certainly all the pageantry of the present. And the pan-Indian culture of today is, I believe, as much benefiting from the past as it is planning towards the future. It's a hybrid, it's an opportunistic, it's an improvising, it's a confident, it's all the self-conscious faith in itself of a lack of pedigree, but it is a pan-Indian culture which is involving its own idiom, and everyone can see it.
But when you talk about idiom, one of the idioms that's involved is the idiom of English, the language that urban Indians, whether they live in the north or the south, are beginning to speak. And clearly that is irreverent, it's hybrid, it's assertive, but it is also an accurate reflection of the many cross-currents that are India today, wouldn't you say?
Well, certainly there was a time when you had to be a purist. And English is not our language, even though a great many Indians believe it is. But English is a language of communication, and you had to be a purist, either in English or in Hindi. And this new generation is saying the key thing is communication. If I can communicate with you and you can understand me, we've got everything going. Let's move ahead.
This is the classic example of English is, I suppose, that slogan, Humko Bini's Mangta. I mean, it's grammatically incorrect. It combines several languages and all of them in slang, and yet it's uniquely effective in its communication.
It is indeed, although something in me also winces, because I believe in the purity of language to some extent.
And that's been destroyed
and
here.
I believe that linguistically we are half-castes and hybrids. We've lost our own mother tongue very often.
But
and we can never really become Englishmen in terms of speech.
But is this English a passing phase or is it here to stay?
I think this is a transitional phase. I believe English will move on to other forms of communication.
Perhaps more bastardized.
Perhaps more bastardized, but perhaps more surely understood, and perhaps even more pan-Indian in scale.
In which case, will English produce its own literature or will it remain stubbornly a colloquial spoken slang?
I wish it was the latter, although I can't prophesy on this.
But you think there are people writing books in English which you would wince at hugely when you had to read?
I think I would.
All right, let's step back for a moment from your book. You've written it almost as if you were an outsider looking back on India. You've written it with detachment, with analysis, and almost with a sort of clinical observation. Do you like what you see of India?
There is much that I don't like, and I think it's only fair for any citizen of any country not to like everything about his country. But there is much that I like, and what I like is that for the first time perhaps in our history, 4 elements have somewhat unintentionally come into critical interface.
These are?
First is democracy, or I call it the improbable survival of democracy. But the fact that it has survived is a huge institutional strength. The second is the new social sanction and acceptability for enterprise. I believe enterprise is something for which Indians enterprise is something Indians take to like a fish takes to water. Thirdly is technology. I don't believe the IT revolution should be overhyped. But I believe that the successes we have made in areas of excellence for the first time create a huge impact. The footprint is much wider than the actual scope it has in the economy. It gives self-worth to people.
And
it makes them believe they can be as good as anyone else in the world. And that is important because today IT is already spreading to other technology sectors. And the last is what I call pan-Indianism, where for the first time Indians across the country are developing symbols and communication models by which they can see themselves as Indians overall.
All right, clearly there is a new India that is emerging, perhaps only in chrysalis stage at the moment, and yet you felt a need to write a book that pierces through the myths that Indians have of themselves, not just the world outside, but Indians do believe what you allege are false myths. In believing these, are they being fools, or are they allowing fools to be made of themselves?
I think that, I don't want to use the word fools, but I think that Indians should now shed the hypocrisies that they have nurtured.
That's almost an appeal your book makes.
It is an appeal because I genuinely believe in it, Karan. I believe that we are the legatees of a great civilization.
But can I put something to you? Is this hypocrisy in a sense not essential? May it not be the case that these myths have been contrived and created because otherwise the truths that they disguise might be too difficult to accept?
No, I believe that the truths that they reveal once you shed these hypocrisies are our strengths very often. Not only our weaknesses.
We have to learn to see them as
We
that.
have to learn to see them because unless we do that, policy making will not proceed on the assumptions that it should. We will continue to appear, frankly, as disoriented to the outside
Very
world.
quickly, because time is against us, is that transition from hypocrisy to acceptance happening?
I think even if we wish it not to happen, it will happen. And I hope my book contributes to it.
But
in
is
some
it
way.
happening fast enough to give you assurance?
I think it is.
And irreversibly?
I think so.
So a new India is there waiting to be recognized, not just by the world outside, but by itself.
I think so.
Pawan Verma, a pleasure having you on Hardtalk India. Thank you so much.